Hello and welcome to our latest online trail produced by Kirklees Local Studies Library in partnership with Discover Huddersfield. My name is Frank Grombier.
And I'm Lorna Brooks. I've been helping prepare the visual aspects of this heritage walk behind the scenes. So I'll be behind the scenes controlling the images during the presentation.
Please send us your comments and questions to the studio via YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. We would love to hear from you and we'll try to answer your questions at the interval and at the end of this program. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, David Griffiths. David is an accomplished local historian with an impressive publication record focusing mainly on Huddersfield's 19th and early 20th century history. In particular, his research has explored the town's municipal governance, emergence of the local middle-class elite, biographies of key figures, popular landmarks, and built heritage. David's public history output has been equally remarkable. Through his role as founder of Edgarwood Heritage Group for Yorkshire, member of numerous local heritage groups including Huddersfield Local History Society and Discover Huddersfield, David has been at the forefront of most popular activities celebrating Kirklees area's diverse history and heritage. Let me now hand over to our speaker, who will take you on a fascinating journey exploring parts of central Huddersfield.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Frank, for that very generous introduction. You've given me a lot to live up to there. People viewing this live will probably have noticed that we're actually in three different places, myself, Frank, Lorna and I, so our fingers are firmly crossed that the technology is all going to work, and we are sorry in advance if there are any glitches along the way, but the COVID constraints continue. As a local historian, especially as Frank said of the 19th century, I've inevitably written a lot about the Ramsden family and their influence on Huddersfield over more than 3 centuries. That influence came to an end actually in September 1920, when Huddersfield Corporation bought out what was by then the enormous Ramsden estate, and various events were planned last autumn to mark the centenary of that purchase, when the town became the town that bought itself. One of those events was going to be a walk around this trail, and needless to say, COVID-19 got in the way, and we're just now picking up the pieces. So during Heritage Open Days this September, I will be doing this trail on the ground, strictly bookings only for Discover Huddersfield, and there will also in September be an exhibition of the Ramsden story on the piazza. So we are trying to catch up a year late, a bit like the Olympics or the Euro 2020, but we're starting today, getting the ball rolling with this virtual version of the trail. For the walk today, we'll start here at the parish church, and we'll walk broadly anti-clockwise around the town centre, eventually down to the Canal, and then back up to St George's Square and that area at the end. Until they sold out to the corporation in 1920, the Ramsdens had been a major player in town affairs, as I've said, for well over 3 centuries. And on this trail, we'll visit a number of sites in and around the town centre which still testify to their influence and illustrate how these locations used to look in past times. Before we start to travel, however, I should say a word about who the Ramsdens were. Originally an Elland family, the first Ramsden in Huddersfield was William, who in 1531 married Joanne Wood of Almonbury, daughter of the wealthiest local landowner John Wood. In doing so, William set a precedent for advantageous marriages, which would recur many times in the family's history. His wife's wealth enabled William Ramsden to embark on a career of owning and dealing in land, just at the time when land poured onto the market from the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. William bought Longley Hall in 1542, now known as Longley Old Hall, and still standing in lower houses, which you see here. William died in 1580, but his descendants, a long line of Johns and Williams, would own ever more of Huddersfield and Almonbury, down to that famous sale in 1920. By that time, over 4,300 acres, all of which was sold, as I've said, to Huddersfield Corporation. Back down in the town, the parish church is a good starting point for the trail and for the story, because it represents the Ramsden's first toehold in the town's affairs. A church on this site goes back to about 1100, long before the Ramsdens came on the scene, and this present building is the third church on the site, dating only from the 1830s. In medieval times, it was often monasteries and priories that had the right to collect the tithes and appoint the vicars of parish churches. And here at St. Peter's, in medieval times, these rights were owned by Nostell Priory near Wakefield. But like the monastic lands, the rights to church appointments and income came onto the market after the dissolution. And in 1546, William Ramsden bought them. This image shows the second church on the site, which was recently built at the time that he bought those rights in 1546. And parts of that church, by the way, do survive, particularly in the crypt of the present church on the site. The next big moment in the story came in 1599, when another William Ramsden, son of the first William, purchased the manor of Huddersfield from Queen Elizabeth I. Manors were units of land ownership, but also key institutions of local government, with the lord of the manor having the right to hold local courts and to demand goods and services from his tenants. Ramsdens were lords of the manor of Huddersfield from 1599 and of Almonbury from 1627. But there's little to show for it until 1671, for which the key site is a short step away at the marketplace. In 1671, John Ramsden, the fifth generation on from that first William, secured a royal charter giving the right to hold a market in Huddersfield. The market cross was erected here, close to the parish church, and on the main route through what was then a small village. It's the route we now know as Kirkgate and Westgate, with little at that time either to the north or to the south of that axis. The market cross, of course, still stands today, although, like the proverbial hammer, which has had new heads and new handles over its life, none of the original stonework now remains. Topped by an orb denoting the supremacy of the monarch, it displays the coat of arms of the Ramsdens and of related families. In 1812, at the height of the Luddite uprising, the cross was removed to Longley New Hall for safekeeping, not to return until quieter times in 1852. John Ramsden, who you see in this portrait, had been granted the market charter by the Stuart King Charles II. But in 1688, John Ramsden supported the Glorious Revolution, so-called, which brought William of Orange to the throne, and he was rewarded the following year by being made Sir John, the first baronet. He's pictured on the Heritage Trail signboard that you can see in the marketplace today. A century later, at the end of the 18th century, the marketplace had become the bustling centre of town life, with the Old George Inn seen at the head of this image, just to the left there of the market cross. Take a good look at its handsome Georgian facade while we're here, because we will return to that later in a surprising way. After another century, in 1888, the fifth baronet, Sir John William Ramsden, presented a fountain to the town to mark Queen Victoria's 50 years on the throne. It's seen here when it was unveiled and stood in the marketplace until 1920. Removed then to St Paul's Gardens at the bottom of Ramsden Street. Ramsden Street, that name is everywhere. It now stands in Greenhead Park. Today, the marketplace, still a focal point of the town, is on the boundary between what we can call the old and the new towns, each of them a creation of the Ramsden estate in the 18th and then in the 19th centuries. Running north from here is the new town of the mid-19th century, which we'll visit at the end of the trail. Running south, as we're looking now, New Street was indeed new in the 1770s, built over an older and narrower lane, leaving the marketplace to the south. The new street's most prominent feature was, and still is really, the brick buildings or New Row on the west side, seen here in today's image with its prominent clock. In effect, this was the town's first shopping parade, with housing above, and now just about 250 years old. Two of the rights of the Ramsdens as lords of the manor were to control the layout of the streets and their names. New Street was the start of an 18th century town plan, which we can see more clearly from the next street corner. Here we are at the centre of the Georgian street grid developed by the Ramsden estate. We're looking south down New Street still, with King Street to the left and Cloth Hall Street to the right. On this map of 1828, we can see the same crossroads. And I think that's just about to come up. We point out the crossroads there. That's the second orange circle from the left is the New Street, Cloth Hall Street, King Street crossroads. The estate's development of this part of the town had begun in 1765, when Sir John Ramsden, the third baronet, built the Cloth Hall, that very prominent feature, which you can see in the highlighted in the leftmost of the circles on the map. 15 years later, Sir John Ramsden's Canal reached the town in 1780 at Aspley Basin, down at the right-hand end of the map and again circled. As the map shows, the straight axis of Cloth Hall Street and King Street, when completed in the early 1800s, linked these two key commercial facilities, both of which, to the extent they're still there, we'll visit in the course of the walk. Down King Street was a slaughterhouse and a butcher's shambles, again a row of small shops, and that's where we're pointing out now in the third circle there on the map. So you have this line from the Cloth Hall through the grid of streets, past the beginnings of the market, really, of the indoor market, the slaughterhouse and the shambles, and down to the canal at the bottom of the town. And these features, the Cloth Hall, the canal, and the slaughterhouse, were all part of the same project, really, to develop Huddersfield as a centre of commerce, to increase its prosperity, and, of course, to capture some of that prosperity for the Ramsden estate in the form of increased rents for the land that it owned. As somebody later said about General Motors and America, what was good for the Ramsdens was also arguably good for the town. Looking, if we can, down King Street from this crossroads, the shambles was replaced in 1880 by the Victorian Market Hall, which many local people still remember with affection. I'm hoping you can see an image. There it is of the Market Hall. As I say, remembered affectionately by local people, although it's now 50 years since it was demolished and replaced by Boots. Boots, of course, now in turn is due to be demolished as part of the new Huddersfield blueprint. So we'll have the fourth, at least, set of buildings on that site in King Street. Turning now from the crossroads back to face the opposite way, the view here is up Cloth Hall Street today at the top to Specsavers and Sainsbury's, with the HSBC Bank prominently on the right-hand corner here. This replaced the Huddersfield Banking Company building, later the Midland Bank, with its distinctive onion dome, seen here around 1900, and again, I think, much remembered in the town. And at the top of the street, in this older image, you can, of course, now see the Cloth Hall itself. And I hope we're going to arrive at the top of the street, Sainsbury's and Specsavers, the Riva bus, all as we know it today. But all of those replacing the Cloth Hall, which stood pretty much where Sainsbury's is today. As I've said, the Cloth Hall opened in 1766 and was extended in 1780 and again in 1864. Here we see the view of the outside of this vast structure, which must have been a really startling addition to the landscape when it was built. a massive building in the context of what was still really growing out of being quite a small village. And the interior view seen here was equally striking. Like the surviving Peace Hall in Halifax, the Cloth Hall's function was to enable the cloth makers of the countryside around Huddersfield to bring their wares to market and to sell them to local and indeed to London merchants. Replacing earlier cloth stalls around the marketplace and in the parish churchyard, the Cloth Hall became the town's commercial centre, both for cloth and for the sale of raw wool. Many based their businesses in the yards nearby, such as Riley's, Brooks Yards and King's Head Yard, which we see in this image, and indeed further down King Street. There were something like 50 yards in the town centre as a whole by the early 19th century. Later on, the imposing warehouses in nearby Dundas Street were a mid-19th century Ramsden development, as cloth manufacturers came to require more exclusive accommodation than the open yards and Cloth Hall stalls to market their wares. Dundas Street was named after the family of Isabella, the wife of John Charles Ramsden, the 4th Baronet. Nearby streets such as Sargenton Street and Fox Street, by the way, were named after trustees who managed the Ramsden estate at that time, before Sir John William, the 5th Baronet, came of age in 1852. We'll be coming back to him and his very important role in due course. The Cloth Hall, increasingly a white elephant in the later 19th century, was demolished in 1930, though its portico and an entrance arch still stand today in Ravensmill Park on Wakefield Road. We'll now make our way to the Town Hall in Ramsden Street, taking, I think, an aerial shortcut for the purposes of this virtual walk. Although the Town Hall stands in Ramsden Street, historically it represents a challenge to Ramsden control. Its construction in 1875 to 81 followed on from the incorporation of Huddersfield as a municipal borough with its own elected town council in 1868. By the standards of neighbouring towns like Halifax, Bradford and Oldham, this was 20 years late. When those towns were granted borough status, around 1848, Huddersfield acquired only some improvement commissioners, with 3 seats reserved for Ramsden representatives alongside the elected members. So 1868 was the moment when modern local government began to take back control, you might say, from the Ramsden estate. Inside on the first floor is a memorial to the corporation's purchase of the estate in 1920, and the key part played in that by local hero Samuel Copley, seen here. The estate had grown throughout the 19th century, as I've said, to more than 4,300 acres, well over half of the borough of Huddersfield. When it came to market, the corporation needed a wealthy intermediary to buy the estate while they obtained the necessary powers. And Copley, who had started his career as a barber in Berry Brow, but made his fortune in land in Australia, put up the money, £1.3 million, perhaps £50 million in today's values, while a bill went through Parliament to allow the corporation to buy. The purchase was completed on the 29th of September 1920, that centenary date I've already mentioned. We'll now make our way down from Ramsden Street, past today's Queensgate Market, to the Ramsden building of the University of Huddersfield. It's in the top of your screen at the moment, and I think we're going to land a bit closer. This splendid Victorian Gothic building, which you'll recognise now stands on the Ring Road, opened in 1883 as the Huddersfield Technical School. It had been founded, the technical school had been founded back in 1841 as the rather splendidly named Young Men's Mental Improvement Society. I'm afraid the ladies didn't immediately get a look in. That was a few years later that they did. It soon became the Mechanics Institute, and it went on in an unbroken line to become Ramsden College, the Polytechnic, and now the University of Huddersfield. The Ramsdens had played no major part in this story, but the building was opened by the Duke of Somerset, father-in-law of Sir John William Ramsden, who had made another of those upwardly mobile Ramsden marriages. And as a result, the building was graced with the family name. It was designed by local architect Edward Hughes, also responsible for the Market Hall in King Street that we've talked about, and it opened with a fine art and industrial exhibition in 1883, which attracted well over 300,000 visitors. Our next target is the canal at the bottom of the university campus. There's the Ramsden building today. And on foot, the best way to get there, at least in normal times, is through the campus. In doing that, we'd pass through the university's red brick central services building. It's recently been renamed the Schwann building in honour of Frederick Schwann, a Huddersfield merchant of German origin who supported his apprentices in establishing that original Mental Improvement Society back in 1841. And you can see the large brick of the Schwann building towards the top left of the screen there. If you don't know the campus, I really would encourage you to make that walk, although again we're taking to the air to avoid any difficulties today along the way. And we're now looking down on the canal at the bottom of the campus. We're close to the point, just off the screen at the bottom actually, where the broad canal from the east, the Ramsden Canal, meets the narrow canal, the Huddersfield Canal, from the west. Most people think of Aspley Basin, where we're about to go, as the meeting point. But strictly speaking, we are on the broad canal here, with the true meeting point, as I say, at the first lock to the west, behind our viewpoint from here. To the east is this handsome canal warehouse, dating from 1774, when the canal was first cut. Today, it's converted to office accommodation, housing, among others, the Bishop of Huddersfield. And as you could possibly even guess by now, it's named Sir John Ramsden Court. The Broad Canal, or Sir John Ramsden's Canal, and here is Sir John Ramsden, the fourth baronet, the third baronet, I should say, whose canal this was cut in 1775 to 80, a few years after the erection of the Cloth Hall, and linked the town to the air and Calder navigation, and thus to the coast via the Humber. And this became a key artery for the town's economic development. The narrow canal followed from 1794 to 1811, making the link to Lancashire and the Mersey, but that was not a Ramsden project. The effective terminus of the Broad Canal, Aspley Basin, was a busy inland port with boat building, rope making, lime burning, and similar industries. And I think we're going to see a couple of images of that shortly, if you can't already see them. Perhaps surprisingly for a town far inland, the Huddersfield Shipping Company was founded here in 1824, offering a direct service to London. A leading figure in the company, and indeed in many of the Aspley industries, was one Bradley Clay, who was also an agent of the Ramsden Canal. It's perhaps no surprise then that one of the company's vessels, a sloop plying that route east to the Humber and the coast, was named Sir John Ramsden. To reach here from the campus, if we were walking, we'd have passed underneath Somerset Bridge. Replacing the narrow and congested old Long Bridge, this was opened by Lady Gwendolen Ramsden in 1874, hence the naming after her father, the Duke of Somerset, who opened the technical school. We'll now take a fair step along the Broad Canal towpath to the next crossing point. On the next crossing point, centre screen there, is what's officially known as Locomotive Bridge, although often referred to as the Turn Bridge. It was indeed originally a turn or swing bridge, giving access from the town to the industrial area east of the canal that took its name, and here we're viewing it looking back from a little further north on the canal. By the mid-19th century, the Turn Bridge needed strengthening to carry heavy traffic from Turnbridge Ironworks between here and the river, and the present lifting mechanism was installed in 1865. Though, like the Market Cross, every part has been replaced at some point since then. This is a suitable point to reflect on the changing role of the Ramsden estate over the course of the 19th century. The canal had been a profitable venture for the estate, but 60 years after it opened, the railway boom of the 1840s was underway. Initially, the Ramsdens opposed railway proposals as unwanted competition with the canal, or favoured a branch line along the route of the canal, terminating at Aspley. With a change of management in 1844, and under strong pressure from the town's business community, they switched to supporting a through railway linking Leeds to Manchester and sold the canal to the Huddersfield and Manchester Railway Company for a handsome £87,000, which again is perhaps around £5 million in today's money. This they used as a war chest for land purchases, and for 40 years the Ramsdens added pretty much any land which came onto the market to their portfolio. In effect, they were withdrawing from their 18th century role in economic development, as we've seen in the Cloth Hall and the Canal, and becoming increasingly a straightforward landlord. Next, we need to return to the town centre, stopping first at the Beast Market. But before that, I'll take a breather for any questions or comments you may have.
Hello, and thanks to everybody for watching us. So let's rest our online legs and ask David some questions.
I've been dreading this bit.
David, I'd like to ask, in the light of recent debates sparked by Black Lives Matter surrounding the involvement of England's prominent historical figures in slavery or slave trade, I wonder if you could tell us whether, if at all, the Ramsden family benefited from it.
Not in any direct way that I'm aware of, Frank. I mean, their wealth was always exclusively British, largely Yorkshire landed wealth. Really, they weren't involved in industry. They weren't involved in the cotton industry, for example, which was obviously had very strong links with slavery. They were landowners, not industrialists. One thing I have done actually, you probably know, Frank. There's a wonderful website now at University of London which has detailed all the slave owners who were notoriously compensated when slavery was finally abolished in the British Empire in 1833, and you can look up everybody who got that massive payout. And there appear to be no Huddersfield examples on that database at all, which I suppose is something we should be retrospectively pleased about.
I think so. Thank you, David, for that.
Some of the later Ramsdens were involved in living in places like Kenya, weren't they? So they kind of were part of that colonial moving out of wealthy people to different places as well.
Yeah, and certainly importantly, in the later 19th century, I mean, having said their wealth was built up as British landowners, they did become owners of extensive rubber plantations in Malaya in the later 19th century. So you're absolutely right. And then Sir John Freshfield Ramsden, who we'll come to right at the end of the story, did indeed sell Huddersfield and because he was more interested in moving to Kenya at that stage in his life, or Kenya as he would then have called it.
Okay, so just to remind everybody, you can make your comments whichever channel you're watching, Facebook, Twitter, or Facebook, and there will be an opportunity, one more opportunity at the end to discuss, to ask any questions you may have, or just make your comment. Just let us know how you like this program. So I think we now can hand over to David again and carry on our journey.
Thank you. That was a fairly easy ride. Does this mean nobody's watching?
We've had 21 viewers so far.
A lot of people watch after the broadcast, I think. I think there's been a positive comment just now. We'll talk some more at the end.
Fine. Okay. So as I've said, we're at the Turn Bridge, and we're going to move on now across the ring road, which I must say is a little bit complicated on the ground if you're trying to follow the trail on foot. But we're going to take to the air again, swoop over the ring road, and land in Beast Market. Now, while cloth was sold in, as we've said, in the marketplace, in the parish churchyard, and later in the Cloth Hall and in those warehouses, excuse me, the Beast Market was where sheep and cattle from the surrounding areas were traded, as its name obviously implies. A house here, perhaps somewhat like number 9, which you can see here, was owned by one Thomas Firth in the late 18th, early 19th century, and it features in a well-known anecdote about the Ramsden estate. Thomas Firth's house was said to be the only freehold in town not to be in Ramsden ownership, and in the early 19th century, Sir John offered to buy it for as many sovereigns as would cover the doorstep. Only, replied Firth, only if they're on their edges, or so the story goes, and he retained the ownership. As a result, it was regularly stated, even in official government papers at the time, that the Ramsdens owned the whole of Huddersfield except for one house. This was always an exaggeration, and indeed, Thomas Firth himself owned a good deal of land on which, for example, Firth Street below the university was developed. It was 1864 before the estate finally acquired Firth's freehold here at Beast Market. We'll now step up Kirkgate and through the parish churchyard to return to Byrom Street where we began, though that will not be the end of our walk. Excuse me a moment. Here in Byrom Street, we can begin to explore the most visible part of the Ramsden legacy, the Victorian New Town. A word first about the name Byrom, which crops up not just here in Byrom Street, but in various places around the town centre. Although the Ramsdens retained their local seats at Longley, first the Old Hall, then the New Hall, their principal residence from the 1630s onwards was at Byrom Hall near Pontefract, which you can see in splendour here in this image. It's now been demolished, and you can see it was a handsome Georgian house, but now demolished, and its former grounds now home to a pig farm. 200 years later, when the parish church was rebuilt in the 1830s, the town was growing fast under the pressures of the Industrial Revolution, with buildings being thrown up in a higgledy-piggledy manner. The Ramsden estate was still happy to collect the rents, but otherwise its management of development was very lax, with visits from the landlord or his agents all too rare. But all that did change from the mid-1840s. The arrival of the railway, now welcomed by the estate, was seen as an opportunity to open up the open fields to the north of the old Westgate-Kirkgate axis and to lay out a handsome new town on a strict rectangular grid of streets. The key figure in this phase of development was Sir John William Ramsden, the 5th Baronet. He came of age in 1852 and was head of the estate for the next 60 years, stepping down only in 1910, abdicating, as he put it. So almost all of what we know as Victorian Huddersfield developed on his watch. The new town which the estate laid out during those decades is seen very clearly on a map from 1905. I'm hoping the map's on its way. I'm still enjoying the view of Sir John William Ramsden myself at the moment, but perhaps others have seen the map by this time. Thank you. I can now see the map. You've probably been looking at it for minutes. We have these synchronization difficulties over the various connections, I'm afraid. So here's the just to get your eye. I think if you know Huddersfield, you'll get your eye in fairly easily, I think, onto this map with the railway station top left, the marketplace roughly in the centre, and running north from the marketplace, linking the marketplace to St George's Square and the railway station. A key part of the new town plan, it was indeed John William Street, providing access to the railway station on what had been a greenfield site. And if you know the town centre, you'll realise that the streets to the right of John William Street, to the east, those there's St Peter's Street, Wood Street, Northumberland Street, and so forth, are all part of this rectangular plan, the Victorian New Town. And so, of course, is Byrom Street, where we began this step in the journey, with its handsome office buildings, all put up for rent by the Ramsden estate around 1880. So it was a 30-year project, really, to develop the Victorian New Town from that start in about 1850. These splendid office buildings, from the marketplace northwards, they're Waverley Chambers on the left of the picture here, and then turning the corner, what was Bulstrode Buildings and is now Kirkgate Buildings, and then on to out of sight to the right on the corner of St Peter's Street, Somerset Buildings. So again, these names keep recurring. The ducal name Somerset we've already met more than once. Bulstrode, the first name of the block here, was that family's mansion in Buckinghamshire. So it goes around the town centre, a variety of street names reflecting different parts of the Ramsden family history. At the next street corner, we do find an intriguing link between the old town and the new. As we come to the corner of St. Peter Street, we saw back in the 18th century when we were in the marketplace, the old George Inn stood on the north side of the marketplace. This was in the way when it came to opening up John William Street, and it was replaced by the new George Hotel in St. George's Square. But much of its handsome classical facade was retained and recycled as the front of a new building in St. Peter Street. And I think you can see, particularly in the central section of the building on the left there, above the white car with its pediment, that you've got a fair representation of the George Inn that we saw in the marketplace in the 18th century. And it was just bodily moved by the Ramsden estate to this location to make way for John William Street. It's now a fairly high-end student accommodation. The old George Inn, in its original location, had been the scene of many important meetings in the town's history, and indeed home to the magistrates' court before purpose-built public buildings were put up. One such meeting, which founded the Huddersfield Canal Company, that's the developers of the narrow canal to the west, their founding meeting in 1793 or 4 is recorded in a plaque on this building. Going a few steps further on Byrom Street now to the corner of Northumberland Street, we see on the right the old post office, which was built at Ramsden expense in the 1870s and partly occupied today by Dugdale's, one of the town's longest established cloth merchants. To the left of the old post office at Dugdale's, we get a glimpse of the open market, opened by Huddersfield Corporation in 1890. This is a good example of the shifting balance of power between the Ramsden estate and the corporation in the latter part of the 19th century. Having acquired the right to hold markets in Huddersfield back in 1671, with the Market Cross and all that, the Ramsdens had jealously held on to those market rights for over 2 centuries, but they did sell them out to the new corporation in 1876. And the corporation then proceeded to open the covered market in King Street, the Victorian building we talked about there, in 1880, and this open produce market 10 years later. From here, it's a short step up Northumberland Street to the centrepiece of the new town development, St. George's Square. So we've now arrived at the handsome heart of Victorian New Town, created by the Ramsdens, and arguably the finest public space in the north of England, St. George's Square, of course. Most obvious as we enter the square is the magnificent railway station of 1847 to 50, commissioned by the railway companies with the Ramsden estate's blessing, and designed in stately home style by the York architect James Piggott Pritchett, who also, by the way, designed the present parish church where we started. The square was soon surrounded by the imposing buildings which still stand today, all commissioned by the estate. Looking clockwise round the square from the station, we find, and we've got an image today and a historic one to follow, we find on the left here, the George Hotel of 1850, the new George Hotel. It was here famously that the Rugby League was established in 1895, again commemorated by a plaque on the building. After some years empty, it's now owned by the council and is to be renovated as part of the Huddersfield High Street Heritage Action Zone, which is just getting underway. Then at the bottom of the square, straight ahead, Lion Chambers followed in 1852 to 54, and that's again by Pritchett of railway station and parish church fame. This was built for mixed commercial uses. The line on the roof today is a fiberglass copy of the original in artificial stone. And then to the right, Britannia Buildings, the last of these great buildings in the square of 1859, occupied first by a merchant, George Crossland. They were essentially warehouse buildings, these, apart from the hotel. And then for many years, Britannia Buildings was home to the Huddersfield and later Yorkshire Building Society. They converted the ground floor into their banking hall in 1926. and a very similar view of this at an earlier time. Just as the estate had initially resisted the railway before their turnaround in 1844, so they had not initially seen the opportunity for an open square here. Amazing that it may seem now, it seems such an obvious and essential feature of Huddersfield today. But in their first plans, the station would have been hidden behind warehouses, as the estate aimed to maximise its rental income from the land it had newly opened up. The Improvement Commissioners, however, having been established in 1848 as the next best thing to a town council, took a different view. Their clerk, Joshua Hobson, also a radical politician and a campaign journalist, saw the potential and won the support of the estate's local agent, Alexander Haythorne. An initial plan for the square was drawn up for the commissioners, and the final plan went one better. You can see the initial commissioners' plan here, and the final plan removing the triangular block to open up the space we know today. The square has been used for many major events over 170 years now. And in an image we have here, it's seen crowded for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, with the statue prominently towards the left of Sir Robert Peel, which stood there from the 1870s to the 1940s. So Harold Wilson today is the second Prime Minister to stand in St George's Square. Stepping out of the square onto Railway Street, we'll soon come on the left to another key Ramsden building. As we swoop round over that top end of the square and descend, I hope, to arrive at estate buildings. Until 1870, the Ramsden's Huddersfield business was still managed from Longley New Hall, remote from the town centre and doubling up as home to the estate's agents, and occasionally when he visited the town to Sir John himself. This was an increasingly unsatisfactory arrangement. In 1870, it was replaced by the exuberant Gothic estate buildings by local architect William Henry Crossland, seen under construction here. That's the building, not the architect, who's under construction, of course. A local man who gained a national reputation, Crossland designed many of the estate's town centre buildings in a wide variety of styles, including the office buildings we saw along Byrom Street and the post office. There's a great deal of evidence still of William Henry Crossland in and around the town centre. Nationally, he's best known for Rochdale Town Hall and Royal Holloway College in Surrey. And by the way, as part of Heritage Open Days this September, I've mentioned the Ramsden exhibition on the piazza. We will be celebrating also the life and work of William Henry Crossland in a meeting at New North Road Baptist Church, so look out for that, if that's your sort of thing. Here at estate buildings, the carved coats of arms on the Railway Street facade to the left on this splendid view are those of the numerous other wealthy families linked to the Ramsdens over the centuries by marriage. Amongst them, though, a dissatisfied stonemason perhaps indicated what he thought of the pay and working conditions on the site by carving a tiny figure bearing his bottom to perceptive passers-by. And you may well want to go and see if you can locate that for yourselves. Although there were good business reasons for the move from Longley to the town centre, estate buildings was far larger than the estate's own office needs, and from the start large parts were let off to other users. For example, to the elected Huddersfield School Board, which was established in 1871. Bear in mind, though, that the building was commissioned in 1869, just the year after Huddersfield was incorporated as a borough and the Ramsdens lost their formal role in its government. It's hard, therefore, not to see estate buildings as a strong statement that the Ramsden estate still had a key role in the town, one it was to retain for another 50 years. From here, it's only a short step down Westgate to return to our starting points around the parish church and the marketplace. In doing so, we pass Byrom Arcade on the left here, a retail development of 1881-82, adorned with the Ramsden coat of arms above the entrance, and also designed by William Henry Crossland. Together with estate buildings in Byrom Street, all from the 1870s and 1880s, it represents the zenith of the Ramsden estate's commercial development of the new town. Their remaining 3 decades of ownership were less heroic, and by 1920, the 6th Baronet, Sir John Freshfield Ramsden, seen here, was ready to sell out to the corporation. As mentioned earlier, he was less interested in managing a large commercial estate and more interested in a life of leisure in what were then the colonies. In the course of this walk, we've seen or spoken of the Ramsden name applied to streets, to buildings, to a college, a canal, and even a ship, all of which is testimony to the immense influence they exercised in Huddersfield over 3.5 centuries. So that brings us to the end of our route for today, and I'd be happy to attempt to answer any more questions or field any comments before we wind up with just a couple of plugs for related publications and activities at the end. So thank you very much for your time if you've stayed with me. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for taking us on such a fascinating journey through the centre of Huddersfield. I certainly learned a lot about street names, lots I didn't know about from before, and I'm sure lots of people will now go and attempt to walk it again by themselves, and we'll be looking for that tiny figure bearing his bottom.
If you're looking for it, a hint is look for sort of a leafy pattern around the building. Look for the leafy pattern and see if you can spot it.
Thank you.
We've got one comment from John Lamb. Very interesting, David. Are there any Ramsdens still living in Huddersfield? He's asking.
We don't think there are any. It's a reasonably common name, obviously. We don't think there's anybody of this family still. There is still a Sir John Ramsden. I'm not quite sure where he lives, but certainly not in Huddersfield. And he has the title, but not so much the wealth. He's been a career diplomat in his life. Most of the wealth, on the other hand, is now concentrated at Muncaster Castle at Ravenglass in Cumbria, which is a large privately owned stately home owned by the Frost Pennington family. But they are, again, Mrs. Frost Pennington is Lady Frost Pennington, I should say, is a Ramsden by descent. So the family does live on, the title lives on, but as far as we know, no Ramsdens in Huddersfield, of which there are a good few, I think, are actually directly connected.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And it seems that the Ramsdens reacted to pressure from townspeople at times, but mostly were absent and unconcerned with the general well-being of the working classes. Would that be a correct assumption? Could you make any comments on that?
I think that's broadly fair. I mean, they saw themselves. Well, they were torn, actually. I think they were profit maximisers. They had a big estate and they wanted to extract the maximum rent from it, and they're much more interested in that than they were generally speaking, in that than in the condition of the buildings that stood upon the land. But they balanced that somehow. They weren't aristocrats. You know, he was only ever a baronet, and any of the Ramsdens were only ever a baronet. They weren't peers. But they did, I think, try to exercise that sense of noblesse oblige, of paternalism, of looking after their tenantry, as they sometimes referred to it. So you do find them making a lot of charitable donations to a variety of churches, a variety of schools, and later on in the 19th century, actually early 20th century, they did become a little bit interested in model housing. Sir John Freshfield Ramsden, before he sold up, seems to have been quite interested in the garden suburb movement, for example, and plans were drawn up for what would have been a quite intriguing little garden suburb at Highfields. Nothing of which nothing came of that at all. But there's a delightful plan of it, which you can find in my book about Highfields, published by the Huddersfield Civic Society. Just to slip in an extra plug. I think so it was a complex relationship, but I think your generalisation about is broadly fair. There was, and certainly in the 1850s, there was a great deal of conflict between the estate and the town. The famous tenant right dispute, when tenants were up in arms about the conditions of tenure. And eventually did secure changes, but that was a big legal struggle that went all the way through to the House of Lords before it was resolved.
That's lovely, thank you. And yeah, thank you for all your comments. Roger Armitage is saying, I'll now look out for the George Hotel. Sheila Dan, fascinating. Thank you, David. And John Lamb,
Hello, Sheila.
John Lamb has added, apparently there are 2 mischievous carvings on estate buildings, but he hasn't yet found a second one.
Yes, John thinks he's found more than
I
anybody
think there
else.
might be 3. I think there might be 3.
Any
My
advance on 3?
colleague, my colleague in Kirklees Local Studies Library, Stan, has photographed some things, so I'm sure he'll share his photographs with the general public very soon.
Excellent.
Okay, now on with the plugs.
Yes, having slipped one in already. So there is a printed version of this trail, which is published by Discover Huddersfield. It's one of the 15 or so different trail leaflets in that format, published by Discover Huddersfield. I would normally say they're available in lots of town centre locations, and I do hope that increasingly becomes the case again as we open up from the COVID restrictions. But I can't promise just how widespread those trails are around the town at the moment. But they can instead be downloaded from the Discover Huddersfield website, which you can see the URL there. And Discover Huddersfield has just restarted its extensive programme of guided walks, so which again you'll find details on the website. Though because of COVID, their bookings are being required, at least for the time being, rather than just turn up and go. And then, so that's all. The trail leaflets are all free. At the other end of the spectrum, a book was published last year by the University of Huddersfield Press in conjunction with the Local History Society. This is Power in the Land, and it was published to mark that centenary last September. And it goes into a lot more detail, if you can bear it, on the story of the Ramsdens and the Huddersfield estate. I'm afraid as a book published by an academic publisher, it costs £30. But the good news is that it can also be downloaded for free, the entire book, as a PDF from the University of Huddersfield Press. And again, you can see how to do that, should you want to browse in any particular aspects there. And I think that's me done. Thank you very much for the commercials. I'm sure I'd like to thank you two and Library Service generally for fantastic support in doing this production. And I hope you're going to give a plug for yourselves now, as well as the ones I've done.
Hand over to Lorna.
If you would like to see more of these tours, there are quite a lot on Kirklees Library's YouTube channel and Kirklees Library's Facebook channel, and we're hoping to do more in future. Get in touch if you want to be involved with them. We're starting just now to be open for appointments in the Local Studies Library at our base in Huddersfield, just for 3-hour slots a couple of days a week. So please email us if you would like to come in and do some research yourself into local history. There's our email address appearing on the screen. And in
they are
case
amazingly helpful.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have lots of interesting inquiries that come into the library, and people such as David doing quite detailed and fascinating research. So it's a lovely place to work. In case you'd like to explore the places we visited today and the images that we've looked at in your own time slowly, we'll add a link under the YouTube video to the Google Earth project that we created to make it. And so if you look in the comments underneath later on, you'll be able to link to the Google Earth in it, and you can turn a corner in your own time and go sideways. But we've really enjoyed doing it. And thank you so much, David, for all your expertise.
No, thank you.
Okay, so last thing is just to thank our audience for being with us today. Thanks for all your likes on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Don't forget to buy or get your teeth into some more of David's books, and watch out for further online walks from us. Bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.